Hello, guys, and welcome to my podcast. I'm your host, Grace O'Connell, and you're listening to The Dominance. Thanks for tuning in. Today, we're going to be talking about the impact that bullying has on the development of people. Is it good or bad? What specific implications does it have? Let's find out, listening to our first guest speaker. All right, our first guest speaker,
Eric Uznai.
So, who are you, and what's your view on bullying?
Well, I'm a student at James Avenue High School, and my view on bullying is that it could be both beneficial and harmful towards the students or the people that are getting bullied or the people doing the bullying.
Have you had any, personal experiences with bullying?
Well, as a child, I got bullied for being fat, but other than that, I've been pretty good now.
Okay, so I wonder if that will come up later in this podcast. Anyway, how does bullying affect a student's aspects in their life?
Well, bullying impacts children socially and culturally. This is because socially they have dealt with this bullying in person with their peers or their friends, and that can ultimately lead them to not be able to communicate their ideas really well. Culturally, they can be bullied because of their appearance or how they dress or how they are brought up by their culture, and in those ways is how they can be bullied. For example, according to the Northern Illinois University, which conducted a research on the prevention and addressing of bullying, kids that are minorities are more likely to be picked on and receive the negative end of bullying. Being a minority has to deal with being different from everyone else in terms of culture. The way you are raised and how you look is a form of culture, and if one gets bullied through that, then that shows that they're getting bullied through culture.
I never really noticed that culture had such a big impact on this. But now can you explain how bullying affects children socially and what that does?
Why, yes. Bullying has to deal with the social lives of children by altering their ability to interact with peers naturally without fear. According to the National Library of Medicine, bullying causes insecurities and leads to low self-esteem in children that get bullied. It is from this low self-esteem and insecurities in children that make them more reserved and develop feelings of loneliness that causes these children to have less social interaction with people. They are afraid they will point out their insecurities and bully them as some do.
Wow, that kind of shows a connection to the medical lens that we researched further in this podcast. So, now that we've discussed the cultural and social aspects, what would you say that bullying has more beneficial or negative impacts?
While many people say that bullying is more negative and poses more negative impacts on children, there are some that argue that bullying is positive in some ways. According to the NIH, U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, quote, it can lead to physical injuries, social problems, emotional problems, and even death. Those who are bullied are at increased risk for mental health problems, headaches, and problems adjusting to school. Bullying also can cause long-term damage to self-esteem, end quote. This shows the negatives that derive from bullying, especially through social, emotional, and physical interaction. Socially, children will be more reserved and have trouble communicating with others. Because of this loneliness, depression can eventually settle in, and then they could resort to harming themselves to compensate.
I never really noticed how bullying can be looked at through all these lenses, and a lot of these connections you're making are to the medical lens, which is really interesting. Could you elaborate more on the positive side?
Yes, some also argue that bullying can be positive. According to a highly credible source by Jovi, the author brings up the idea that bullying can be positive for the ones doing the bullying. The author argues that a bully may gain self-esteem as a result of bullying other kids. This positively affects the bully by bringing them confidence and a higher level of self-esteem. Is this enough to say that bullying is positive? The parents of the bully may like the idea of bullying helping their child build self-esteem. Meanwhile, the parents of the child that is getting bullied will always disapprove of bullying because of the fact that their child loses self-esteem and confidence as bullying harms them.
I've never heard of that before. That's actually really interesting to look into, and I wonder if the more people get self-esteem and it outweighs the negative impacts that it has. So now for your panel question, let's talk about, what do you think about cyberbullying?
I think cyberbullying has similar effects as physical bullying because even though it is on the phone, the same idea and principles are still there.
That's really interesting. Do you think that this leads to the same benefits as the self-esteem you were talking from before?
I think so, because a bully is going to be a bully, and in their head and in their way of thinking, they think, oh, I'm going to bully this kid because I need to be cooler. So
Yeah.
even on the phone or in person, that still applies.
Yeah, I really see that from your perspective. Thank you. Now that we've gone over the social and cultural lens, we're going to be talking about the ethical lens and the ethics behind this. So, we're bringing in our famous researcher.
My name is Julianne Galou, and I'm an expert in the ethical considerations of bullying. From an ethical standpoint, bullying includes many factors that may damage individuals in their developmental stage. Bullying can be physical, verbal, or relational, which can all impact adolescents significantly in negative ways.
So, what do these different forms of bullying entail for like the victim or like the person who's being bullied?
Well, according to Eunice Kennedy Shriver, the physical side includes many forms of inflicting harm upon a victim, as well as their belongings, or forcing them into acts which they do not wish to commit. The verbal method is also essentially mentally targeting a victim, which includes verbal threats of harm, as well as insulting and intentionally spreading false statements about another individual.
That's really interesting. So, how does bullying specifically impact the individuals negatively? Or what implications may bullying contribute to in their everyday life?
Well, due to all three types of bullying, students may try to avoid school or miss it whenever they possibly can, which could damage their academic career and future success. Bullying can also cause depression, loneliness, and anxiety, which are serious mental health concerns that may lead an individual into self-harm and sometimes even death.
That really relates to two of our other lenses, futuristic and scientific and medical. That's a really good connection to make. So some may say that bullying is worth any ethical issues because it helps toughen people who are bullied and prepare them for a harsh society. Also relating to the social lens we heard about earlier, how it boosts the ego of the people who are doing the bullying. So have you found this to be the case?
Well, I personally think, how could it possibly be resilience if one cannot even survive the process? Bullying also has other destructive results on a student's well-being, such as pushing them towards poor behaviors, such as running away. There also may be unexplained injuries on a student that are left untreated, destruction of a student's property, trouble with sleeping, and bad dreams. Also, the avoidance of social situations, which leads to individuals having little to no friends. And bullying is surely not ethical, as students are constantly suffering through torturous circumstances, which cause them long-term harm, and in serious cases, they can even die.
Wow, this is a lot of negative effects that we didn't go over earlier, so it's really important to add this to our podcast. So if bullying is such an ethical concern, how could society be changed to solve or prevent the issue? What can we do to make the environment better and reduce bullying?
Well, people talk about bullying a lot, but they don't really take it seriously enough as a big issue in society. So when it comes to ethics issues around the world, bullying is often left out. One efficient solution that we could do to help this would be to bring more attention to bullying, especially in current forms like cyberbullying. This wasn't a big consideration in the past, but now it's becoming more and more prominent in society. So communicating the detrimental impacts of bullying onto its victims may prevent many from bullying, as they will better understand the consequences of their actions onto their victims.
So, leading into a more personal aspect, how have you personally experienced a lack of bullying awareness?
Well, when I was growing up, bullying was often brought up, and authority figures would encourage students to avoid bullying and stand up against it rather than being a bystander. But now that I have done further research into bullying and understand the devastating consequences it can cause, I now realize that us as kids were never actually taught what bullying can actually do to someone in an ethical sense. Simply being told to not bully because it hurts other people's feelings is not enough to motivate a bully to stop their process.
Something that specifically interests me around the ethics of this topic is resilience. Can you tell me what resilience is to you, and if bullying helps students gain resilience?
Well, Lin Li-yin defined resilience as the internal ability of an individual to handle difficult situations, and I completely agree with this. She also talked about a study on 7th and 10th graders who experienced bullying, which showed that with lower resilience levels, they were at a higher risk of depression, and those with a higher resilience level were at lower risk for depression. Resilience was needed to protect those against bullying. It doesn't necessarily build it up.
But how does this relate back to ethics?
Well, this relates to ethics because bullying can cause depression, which is a serious mental illness, if those who are bullied do not have enough resilience for it. While bullying may help build up more resilience, it is still unethical because it causes serious and harmful results like depression in the process.
I see. Now for your panel question, do you think that bullying can have good implications? Like, what are your main positives that you know about it?
Well, I think that in some cases, bullying can help build up resilience in victims, but in a lot of cases, like, it affects their mental health too much that it's not really worth the risk that they'll gain depression from being bullied. But in some cases, like, victims may build more resilience and they will end up with happier lives. But overall, I just think bullying is a negative process.
I see. So we have some conflicting opinions on the impacts of bullying, whether they're being good or bad, which is really interesting. All right, time to move on to our next speaker. Welcome back to The Dominance, where we will explore complex topics through lenses of scientific and medical. Today, we're diving deep into the issue of bullying. Bullying affects millions of people worldwide, with serious consequences for mental and physical health. But what does science and medical tell us about this problem? To help us unpack this issue, we're joined by Dr. Olivia Moran, a leading researcher in psychology and bullying prevention. Welcome, Dr. Moran.
Thank you for having me.
Why don't we start by defining bullying and what exactly it is from a scientific perspective?
Well, great that you asked me that, because actually this morning while I was drinking my morning coffee, I read a government associated source from Stop Bullying, and I recall they did a very good job in assessing the definition of bullying. Yeah, so bullying it's a pattern of aggressive behavior, and it involves a power imbalance typically repeated over time.
I see.
Yeah, that's great that you see. It can take many forms, including physical, verbal, and relational aggression, and it often occurs in settings such as schools, workplaces, and online environments.
Yep, definitely the top 3 places. Alright, so what are some of the psychological and emotional effects of bullying?
Well, bullying can have profound effects on mental health when you come to think about it. So it can increase rates of anxiety, depression, and it could lower a person's self-esteem. Yeah, so victims of bullying, they may also experience social withdrawal and academic difficulties.
Relatable.
Oh, and sometimes even suicidal thoughts or behavior. Importantly, these effects can persist into adulthood if not addressed at an early stage.
When I woke up this morning and I was drinking my coffee, I started reading this article to prepare me for the podcast and what I was gonna see. And I read from the NIH U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. And this is a quote I found. Quote, "Children and adolescents who are bullies are at an increased risk for substance use, academic problems, and violence to others later in life. This relates to our futuristic lens that we'll go into more detail later about how bullying can lead to other problems that are also impactful to a person's health." Let's delve into the neuroscience of bullying. How does bullying affect the cognitive brain power behind someone?
Well, funny you ask, because research suggests that bullying can alter brain structure and function.
Really?
Particularly in regions involved in emotion regulation and stress response.
That seems important.
So chronic exposure to stress hormones such as cortisol can impair neural connectivity, and it contributes to long-term mental health issues. I read all this from the Dana Foundation while I was taking a quick trip to the restroom after my morning coffee.
Fascinating. And what about the roles of genetics in predisposing individuals to bullying behavior?
So there actually is evidence that suggests that genetic factors play a role in predisposing individuals to aggressive behavior.
I would have never thought that.
Yeah, so however, genetics alone, they do not determine behavior, and environmental factors such as family dynamics and social influences also play a significant role.
So what you're saying is that the environmental factors have a bigger impact than the behavioral?
Essentially, yes.
I see. Now, looking into the more medical perspective, how does bullying impact physical health, like how fit you are?
So, actually, bullying has been linked to a range of physical health problems, and these include headaches, stomach aches, and sleep disturbances. So, chronic stress from bullying can weaken the immune system, and it increases the risk of chronic conditions such as cardiovascular disease later in life. So, this one I remember from my extensive studies during medical school in the American Society for the Positive Care of Children, which is the source I studied this from before a test.
That's really crazy how you can relate something all the way back to middle school.
Not middle school, but medical school, if that's what you meant.
That's what I meant.
Yeah.
So, are there any interventions or treatments that have been effective in addressing bullying in the medical sense and not like the assembly sense?
Well, prevention, it is key, and interventions that focus on fostering positive relationships, building empathy, and teaching conflict resolution skills have shown lots of success in reducing bullying behavior.
That's good.
And to include, early identification and intervention are critical to mitigating the long-term effects of bullying on mental and physical health. It's essential to recognize bullying as a serious public health issue that requires a multidisciplinary approach. So by understanding the science and medicine behind bullying, we can then work together to create a safer and more supportive environment for every individual. This is heavily important as bullying is a large issue among schools that is very difficult to monitor. Therefore, creating a safe environment is vital in many cases.
Thank you. So, that concludes our portion on medical and scientifical. Thank you, Dr. Moran, for sharing your insights with us and enlightening us today.
My absolute pleasure.
So, for my panel question for Dr. Moran, were you ever bullied in high school?
You thought I was bullied in high school? Back in my days, I was the bully.
No!
Yeah. I think it helps build people's character, and it hasn't harmfully impacted me in any way, as you can see how much I'm thriving with my medical degree that I have received and put hard work into. I was always dominant back in my days.
They don't call this the Dominance podcast for nothing. Okay, guys, we're on to our last guest speaker, Veronica Arbogast. She is a futuristic researcher.
So now that we have heard the information about bullying on the economic, social and cultural, ethical, scientific and medical lenses, we will explore how bullying impacts the futuristic lens. So the scientific and medical lens also discussed implications on the victim's health, but how far can this impact victims' futures? This is only one area of a threat to the future from bullying, but there are so many more. Social and cultural aspects are affected because of it. If a specific thing is being made fun of at the time, it could lead to a bigger groups joining in on this.
This is very interesting. So, exactly what does this all mean?
So all of these troubles occurring from bullying will impact the way victims grow up and raise their children. Therefore, our economy might suffer from bullying entirely. If it is extreme enough, it could lead to racism or even a genocide.
That's really crazy. Guys, think about how much that impacts our history.
So according to Consequences of Bullying Behavior from the National Academics Press, it discusses many long-term effects, including sleep disturbances and many other health issues.
Does that mean that sleep strongly correlates with like someone's success and what happens in their future?
Yes, that's exactly what happens. So if sleep is being interfered with, then so is their future. And
I'm guessing that this leads to like some negative impact and like something like that.
yes, definitely. So from the New York Times article, More Than Ever, Teenagers See a Bleak Future. It discusses the many pressures on teenagers and the difficulties of growing up with these struggles. One of the major struggles found within these teenagers was bullying and anxiety it gives them.
I think that's a really big deal, especially because of how many teenagers have to deal with it. This is pretty crazy. Based on your research, do you believe that like bullying can be controlled in like an environment or an event or something like that?
So, based on all my research, I think it's almost impossible to control bullying.
That's kind of bad, don't we think?
Yeah, definitely, because of all the different ways that bullying can be accessed or occurred. Bullying can take place through social media, in person, or through gossip. And the way it happens can impact people differently, because with social media, there's not much of an escape.
Yeah, there's really no limitations that we could put on social media because there's so many differing opinions about it and how much people have access to it.
Exactly. And in-person bullying can make people not want to go wherever they're going to be bullied. So essentially, it can stop them from doing the things they love. Gossip bullying can break up friendships and create trust issues.
I definitely hear a lot of gossip in my day. So, personally, do you think bullying's like a forgotten problem? Because I know how things change like through different generations.
Well, I mean, I think it is acknowledged, but not as much as it should be. Because, like, sometimes people forget about the struggles teenagers are going through, and bullying really impacts their lives.
Yeah, I heard a really sad suicide story about bullying, and I think that a lot of people forget the impact that bullying can have on a person. So, for my panel question, what do you think about cyberbullying? Because I know that we already talked about it, but it's so common because so many people use it so often, especially teenagers, and it has so many impacts because of the access to it. And it differs between different families, different situations. So what do you think?
So I think, honestly, you're right. I mean, you can't really get away from it. And most people end up having to have a phone because they need to access their parents or contact whoever, but it ends up being toxic because people constantly are on their phones, and then if they're getting bullied online, then they come home and they can't get away from it at all.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. It creates no boundaries between people, and I also think people are more bold and confident with what they say, so more people definitely bully online because they don't have to deal with the repercussions. All right. That seems to be everyone. So, listeners, what do we think about the issue from what we've learned today? Leave a comment down below. Thank you so much for joining me, and I'll catch you on the flip side.